Hey guys, welcome back to 247 DIY. Today we're going to be jumping back into the WRX here. I made a little bit of a splurge purchase, but I'm pretty excited about it. Let's go ahead and get that unboxed and I'll show you what we're working with. Alright guys, so here it is. I picked up a STI Replica wing for the WRX. It's something that I've been wanting to put on the car pretty much since I got it. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to pretend that this is an STI at all. I love this wing so much more than the stock WRX wing. So this one here, like I said, it's a replica. It's not an OEM piece, but that saves me quite a bit of money. This is actually from Ikon Motorsports. It's paint matched to the 01G paint that's on this 02. You can find their store. They have their own website, or they have an eBay store. Also, they're on Amazon. These are about $400, which isn't a bad deal considering they're paint matched. The only issue I had, and I hesitate throwing this out there because I don't want to sound like I'm bashing anybody, and I don't want to hurt anybody's business. But I do want to comment on their very good customer service. I'll show it probably a little bit later. But there was a little bit of a blemish in the paint on the back side of the spoiler. I was a little disappointed to see that. It's in a pretty noticeable area, so I took a picture of it, I sent it to them, and I mentioned it to them, and they actually credited me back a decent amount of money, basically so that I could try to touch it up myself, so the money would be offsetting the costs of, the labor and everything that goes into fixing that. So again, not trying to discourage anybody from buying one of these. I think they're an amazing deal. So I'm pretty excited to get the WRX wing swapped out with this one. But before we can get onto that, I still got the vehicle up in the air. Like I said last time when I was underneath, I noticed just one thing we got to fix. I noticed a leak in one of the banjo bolts on one of the brake calipers. So let's jump into that, get that buttoned up real quick. That way we can put the car on the ground and we can get this thrown on the car. Okay, so it's been a minute since I did the caliper conversion on this, but I do remember when I bled the brakes, I did end up with a little bit of a leak from one of the banjo bolts, and I think it was this front driver's side that's leaking again. So I don't know exactly what's going on there, but I figure to eliminate the possibility of it being inferior copper crush gaskets, I went and picked up some of the factory crush gaskets for that banjo bolt. And when we unbutton everything, I'm just going to go ahead and look and make sure there's not like an imperfection in the casting on the caliper that might be cutting into the gaskets and creating a leak. I'll check out the banjo bolt, and as long as all the surfaces are smooth, we'll swap out the copper crush gaskets, and hopefully that's going to solve our issue. So you can see here, this is what I ended up noticing. You can see the wetness here, brake fluid down on the rim. And although it is hard to see probably on camera, it is dripping from underneath that banjo bolt there. Now, if you're going to be bleeding brakes by yourself, which I find myself doing quite frequently, it can be very handy to build yourself a self-bleeder bottle like this. I've had this thing forever, and I have used it on countless cars, and it's never failed me. So this is basically just a Powerade bottle and some vacuum line. You have one long hose here. It goes through a hole in the cap and down into fluid inside the bottle. This end is what goes to the bleed nipple on your caliper. And then you have one short piece of vacuum hose that just goes through the cap, and that allows air to enter the bottle if fluid goes down, and it allows air to come out of the bottle when fluid comes up. So basically, in order to use this, very simple. You put this on your bleed nipple, you crack your bleeder free, Then you can either step on, or I usually end up pushing the brake pedal by hand, and you just watch for air bubbles coming out of this hole down in the reservoir. And the reason why this works as a self-bleeder is when you let the brake pedal back up, you don't have to worry about air going back into the caliper, because it can only suck up this fluid which stays in the bottle, hence why it's a self-bleeder. It's not a two-person job when you use one of these. So let's go ahead and just get these bled real quick, and that'll wrap this up. Alright guys, so before we can go ahead and get that beautiful STI wing on this, we got to go ahead and remove the original WRX wing. Alright, so it looks as though the WRX wing is only held on with 4 bolts. You got one here, one here, one here, one here. You're going to have the electrical connector for the third brake light, and I'm not sure yet, but I believe it looks like they've got some sort of wire safety anchor. I think that's going to be, we'll find out in a minute, but I'm pretty sure that's going to be, just in case that wing should have come off, it's going to be held on by these safety cables. We'll find out in just a second. So the cable here is a 12mm bolt. And it's actually one of your trunk hinge bolts. So just going to throw that back in for now. And your spoiler bolts are 10mm. I'm going to take the bottom one all the way off. I'm going to leave this top one just loose for now while we work on the other side so it doesn't fall off when we start working the other side off. So next we just need to go ahead and clean up this deck lid. There's quite a bit of dust on here, both just from underneath the spoiler, because the car's been sitting for a long time, and there's a little bit of silicone that they use to seal some of these bolt holes. So I'll get this all cleaned up. I won't bore you guys with that, and when we come back, it'll be nice and clean. Okay, so next what we need to do is we need to make a template of the bolt holes for the underside of the bottom portion of the wing. So I'm going to do first is I'm going to take the hardware, I'm going to thread it into the holes. We're going to place a little dab of grease on each one. Then what we're going to do is we're going to cut out a large piece of the cardboard box it came in. We're going to set that down on the box. I'm going to trace an outline so that we can cut it to a similar shape of what the wing is. Then we can place that on the trunk. We can see what holes line up. From what I've read, there should be 2 of the WRX wing holes that meet up with some of the holes here, but we won't know that till we get the template on, so let's go ahead and get that knocked out. So the bad news is none of the holes line up. From what I was reading, that may have been the factory STI wing, because I don't believe this replica uses the same bolt holes to secure to the trunk. Either way, none of the bolt holes line up, so we're gonna have to go ahead and transfer this as carefully as we can to make sure the wing stays straight. So what I think I'm gonna do first is we're gonna try to line this up to where it looks good and it seems centered. And then I'm gonna use this dry erase marker to lay out where roughly, or hopefully pretty close to where it needs to be, and we'll compare our pattern to that. So another thing we're going to have to work out is they leave a hole here, I'm assuming, for your wiring for the third brake light, which doesn't line up to the hole for the original wiring pass-through. So let's go ahead and get the third brake light installed in this, and we'll see what we can do about that. And one other thing I did was, after reading the reviews of this specific wing, is most people said that this factory hardware to mount it down to the trunk lid is not long enough. So I went and picked up some stainless steel ones. These are about 9 millimeters. These are 20 millimeters. My only concern is maybe they're a little too long. I don't think they're going to be. Worst case scenario, we can cut them shorter. I don't like that they're 8 millimeter heads versus 10 millimeter heads, but the flange is roughly the same size. And I've got some washers laying around to widen that out a little bit if we need to. Okay, so moment of truth. Obviously, anytime you have to go and drill into your paintwork, it makes you a little concerned. But I'm pretty confident where I got these holes laid out, so let's go ahead and do it. Going to be starting out with just a small pilot hole on all these, and then I'm going to come back through with a 7 millimeter drill bit. That's pretty close to the size of the bolts. We may need to widen them for a little bit of wiggle room, but I don't want them too wide right off the bat. So we'll slowly walk the holes wider if we need to later on. Now, hindsight being 2020, what I should have done is before I drilled these 7mm holes, I should have left those small pilot holes so that I could use this hole saw to remove this inner skin. This bit on here is not too far off from the 7mm I used, so it shouldn't wander too much. I think we should be able to do a good job with this now. Okay, so you saw me pull out the angle grinder for a couple of them there. That hole up in there, when it drilled through, it was so close to the opening of this one, I couldn't get that hole saw on there without it jumping out into this hole. So I just gave myself a little access here. It's not pretty, but it'll do. And then another thing I'm going to do is, if you see right here, one of the middle hole for the spoiler there comes through right in the edge of this hole. So it's going to be a pain in the butt. But this is the hole where your wiring came through for the third brake light. So what I may do is I may not use that bolt hole, or that nut I should say, on the spoiler. We'll actually take and cut that nut right out, and I think we'll continue to use this for the port for the wiring for the third brake light. Before we install the wing, we need to plug up these old holes in the wing. And I've got these small rubber gaskets. They were just left over from an old project. They fit nicely in these smaller holes. And they actually fit so tight, I don't think I'm going to need to. I was going to run some sealant around, but they're so snug in there, I don't think I'm going to need any sealant. And then for these larger holes, I was thinking about reusing, because this is where that cable came through, I was thinking about reusing that factory cable, but I just don't think I'm going to do it. I don't want to drill any more holes than are necessary in that wing. So we're just going to plug these up. And I didn't have a grommet that size, so I have this really thick-walled, stiff silicone tubing. I'm going to shove that down in there till it's relatively flush, and then we'll just fill the opening with some black RTV silicone. Okay, so next the kit comes with this self-adhesive foam strip, and we're just going to run the perimeter of this wing. I hope there's enough. It doesn't look like there's going to be, but maybe it's just enough. So let's go ahead and we'll do that. All right, so there was just enough there. Let's go ahead and throw this on the car now. Okay, so all in all, that went relatively smooth. This one still gave me an issue up in here. You can see I had to hack at this some more with the angle grinder. It's not very pretty. I may come up with some sort of plate, or even maybe if I can get some silver vinyl wrap and just cover that up so it's not quite so visible. The 20mm bolts are a perfect length, and everything came together pretty good. So let's go ahead and get the top piece on. And one thing I want to point out, I was hoping that it was going to pull this seam down a little bit more than it did. So it leaves a little bit of a gap. I think in the future what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back through, I'm going to try to pull out some of this rubber gasketing, and then I'll just go ahead and seal this with maybe some gray silicone, or if I can find silver silicone. I don't know if they make silver silicone. And just get that in there, kind of like when they put fender flares on, and to finish up the gap, maybe seal that just a little bit better. Alright, so the last thing I'm going to do before we go ahead and do the big reveal on this is we need to work out this third brake light wiring. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with a small piece of silicone tubing that we did on the top. And we'll fill that with some silicone just to create a bit of a seal there. And as long as we're on the topic of sealing things up, I realized that we're doing all this sealing around these other holes, and yet there's no sealant for the bolt holes. So what I'm going to do is off camera, just because it's going to be relatively boring, is I'm going to take each one of these bolts out, put some silicone around the head of the bolt, and then put them back in, tightening the bolt down around the silicone, and that should seal up all the bolt holes. Okay, so one thing I didn't want to do was have to cut this WRX wing up, because I was hoping to maybe sell it. But it is what it is. I'm going to have to steal this plug off here. So that's about it, guys. The only other thing that's going to be left to do is you can still see the footprint from where the old spoiler sat. So that's just going to need to be buffed out. I imagine just some paint correction, a clay bar, and little cut-in compound. Should be able to make that disappear no problem. Alright guys, so there it is. We got this STI wing on there. I'm absolutely loving it. I think the STI wing looks light years better than the WRX wing in my opinion. So I'm super happy to have that on there now. That's going to do it for today's episode. If you liked the video, feel free to hit that like button. If you saw something that you want to mention, go ahead and leave a comment below. And if you're not subscribed already guys, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Thanks.